everyone, Wantonton here, back to bring you a One Piece deck guide. This time I'm going to be showing my Big Mom deck. With this deck, I was able to win one of our locals here, as well as finish third and eighth at two of our store championships that numbered about 32 people. She is definitely the less popular of the two main yellow leaders, the other one being Katakuri. And I do think Katakuri is definitely very strong, and I think in general is a stronger deck just because he gives you info on you or your opponent's life cards, as well as being able to swing 7k every turn is just so strong. But yellow Big Mom is definitely not slacking. She has a very strong ability as well, where at 2 life or less, you are able to just shuffle around the cards in your life, just swapping them with cards in your hand, which is very strong in its own right, and sometimes can just swing you the game. I do want to take the time now to remind you guys that her ability does activate at 3 life because the first part of her ability, you take one of your life cards to your hand and then you check for the second ability. So I think that the main difference between this deck and the main yellow Katakuri deck is that you can afford to run more triggers just because, unlike Katakuri, you are able to just put them in your life. So this deck does have the ability to just swing the game very wildly in your favor just off of your triggers. And that is, I'm going to say, probably one of your main win conditions here, actually. So let's get right to it. Let's start with the core cards first. Let's start off with, I like 4 Big Moms. I just think she is just the main win condition of yellow. It's really hard to win some matchups without her. I have seen some yellow Big Mom decks running a more mid-range variant where they don't run any 10 costs at all. I personally think this deck sometimes lacks the firepower if you do remove these 10 drops. And so I choose to have 4 just because in certain matchups you just want at least like 1 or 2 in your hand, just getting you ready for that that 10 dawn turn. So next up, we're gonna have 4 puddings. Not much more to say here. She's just a searcher, and then Perospero as well. Just because he is a searcher attached to a 5,000 body. On top of that, you can get him off of your trigger just from discarding 1 card from your hand. Next up, I like to run 4 crackers as well. He provides so much pressure, and because this deck you do kind of want to sometimes take an early life damage just to get to 3 life earlier, Cracker is a way of equalizing that damage as well as just providing a lot of pressure. Your opponent has to play a bit more defensively with them on the board because they also don't want to take a double attack. Next up, let's run 4 Thunderbolts. I think Thunderbolt is so strong in this deck, especially because you can just put them in your trigger and you can place it there when there's a 5-drop. Maybe maybe plays against a law, he has a blocker law up or something, and you just need to try to get rid of it. Or sometimes you can use it to set up lethal just by placing it in your life in preparation for your next turn, and when you know your opponent's going to swing into you, you can use it to get rid of one of their blockers. And these 5 are going to be the core of your deck. But to be honest, most yellow decks, both Big Mom and Katakuri, are going to look sort of similar just because yellow is a new color here, and there just isn't a lot of variety yet. But I do think that these 5 cards are staples, and you're going to want to have at least a playset of each in your deck. Every other card I'm going to show from here on out is going to be more or less similar to a lot of other yellow decks, but they are not necessarily needed to run your deck. Next up, I'm going to run 4 Shirahoshis here, and as I said, this is going to differ a little bit from some Katakuri decks I've seen, where a lot of them don't run Shirahoshis at all because you can't guarantee to put them in your life, and you don't really want to pay 5 Dawn to play Shirahoshi or anything. And she's only a 1,000 counter, which I'm not really a fan of. But with Big Mom, you can definitely just put her in your life, and she has a very strong effect where you're able to cycle out some cards and just fish. So I liked running 4 of her. I am a fan of 2 categories. I've tested between 2 to 4, and I think two is just a sweet spot. Anymore, sometimes he just kind of clogs your hand. And this deck, and yellow actually in general, already has the problem of bricking a lot, just because a lot of your cards don't have counters. So I'm happy at two with Katakuri, but of course I've seen anything from 0 to 4 categories. So just whatever you feel like is best for you. And the same is gonna go for 7 drop Big Mom here. I run two as well because sometimes it kind of just sits in your hand as well. And once again, I have seen anywhere between 0 to 4 for her. I personally like to run 4 Brules. She is so strong as a trigger. She's very disruptive, and I like to shuffle her down to my last life because when your opponent's going for lethal, she really just throws a wrench in their plans and can sometimes just win you the game just by buying you the one extra attack and buying you the one extra turn. Katakuri, I run three of. I I like Katakuri. I think sometimes he's a good tempo play. He's a solid body, and he has rush. You can take a look at their triggers, but I have seen some people not run him, and that's fair too. He does once again he does clog your hand because as you can see, what we have so far, we already have 4 cards here that kind of just sit there without a counter in hand. So I totally understand why some people wouldn't run Katakuri at all. Next up, I run 2 smoothies just because I think one of yellow's strengths and one of the main win conditions of yellow is to try to trigger off of some of these 5,000 bodies like smoothie, cracker, or parasparrow from your life. And I'm going to encourage that you do so in most situations. It's such a strong tempo swing, and you're going to find that you're going to get a lot of your mid game advantage from triggering these cards. Overall, I think she is the weakest of the 3 5,000 bodies here, but her effect does come in handy sometimes. Maybe when you're pushing for lethal, or if you're playing against like a Nami, for example, where they never hit your life. That's a way of drawing a card and at the same time applying pressure. Next, I like 2 Ikaku sovereignties. I've seen between 0 to 4, and once again, it really is up to you. I think this is good because sometimes it does clog up your hand. And just a reminder, you don't actually have to use it for the 5,000 counter. Sometimes it kind of works like a brulee as well, where I like to put it at the bottom of my life because it disrupts the opponent's lethal. It also sets you up for a lot of crazy turns or crazy potential plays where you just sovereignty into a brulee life maybe, and that's just so strong. Next, I like 2 buzzcut mochis. A lot of times you're going to be at lower health, and this is a lesser popular card actually. But I find that in against more aggressive matchups or more board centric matchups is a very strong card since you are going to be at a lower life total than your opponent usually, and you can just pop one of their 4Ks or less. And at the same time, it has a strong trigger where you can play a 4 cost or less from your hand. Now the rest of the deck is going to be filled with 2,000 counters. So we're gonna have 4 Sanjis here. Then we're going to have 4 Strusens. And then we're going to have a pudding. 2,000 pudding. And this is the deck. This is basically the full deck list I use here. Sanji pudding is pretty much never going to be used. She's pretty much just a 2,000 counter. But Sanji can be used in some matchups, maybe against a Law or a Zoro. You just need a body on the board to contest their smaller guys. And Strusen can sometimes come in handy. Maybe you're just trying to get rid of a 1 drop blocker. And maybe where you're pushing for lethal or something. But most of the time, these three are going to just be 2,000 counters. So here's the full deck list. I'm going to link it down below as well, so you can just quickly go take a look at it. Now I'm going to be talking about some mulligans. Keep in mind, I am going to talk about it in a very general manner just because I don't want this video to go on for too long. So let's get started here. If you are going second and you are playing against a mid-range or control deck, the type of deck where you expect to be able to live a little bit longer, it is very standard what you are trying to mulligan for. You want to mulligan for a 4 drop and 10 drop big bomb, and that's pretty much all you really care about. Again, this is in a more general sense here, because when you do go second against these type of decks, your turns are going to play out more or less the same every game. Dropping you're going to be playing on curve. You're going to be dropping your first 4 drop on your second turn. Ideally, you'll play another 4 drop on your third turn, and then on your fourth turn, you're going to be playing either 7 drop Big Mom or 8 drop Katakuri. And then on your fifth turn, you're just going to drop 10 drop. That's the ideal sequence of events for you if you're going second, and it's not going to really differ from game to game. You're just going to want to survive until 10 drop Big Mom and just kind of just take it from there. When you're going second and you're against a aggro deck like Zoro, you are going to want to just kind of trash those 10 drop Big Moms. Even the 8 drop categories are sometimes dead cards. You kind of just want to focus more on 4 drops or your 3 drop Parasparrow. Even 7 drop Lin Lin is pretty good here, just because they are forced to either give you a life or lose a life of their own. So either they're extending the game for you or they're shortening the game for themselves. Now, when you go first, though, ideally you always want to go second, because going first as yellow is very, very awkward, just because most of your cards are even, and so going first makes it very, very rough. And the way you play this deck when you're going first is very different from how you play this deck going second. You almost want to just switch gears and kind of play a more tempo mid-range game, just because that's how you're going to curve out a little bit better. And you don't typically want to rely on 10 drop Big Mom unless you are playing against a slower deck. It does take an extra turn for you to get to 10 Dawn. But anyways, going first, you do just want to mulligan for either a Pudding or a Parasparrow, and I would just suggest you mulligan out unless you see one of those cards. The the absolute best hand you can get going first is a Pudding, a Parasparrow, and then a Charlotte Linlin, the 7 drop one, just because it curves out very nicely. Those are pretty much your only odd numbered cards that you're going to be playing. And so those are cards I would look for, although Charlotte Linlin is something you wouldn't want against a faster deck. If you guys have any more specific questions regarding the mulligans, just feel free to comment them down below. Again, I don't want to get too into it. This video is already getting a little bit long. And just matchups wise, I'm just going to talk about the worst and the best matchup for you. The worst matchup for you, I'm going to say, is Law. Law is just so much faster and just completely out tempos you. Yellow doesn't really have removal that you can just reliably use at any time. And your cards do take a little bit longer to develop than Law, and so what happens is he's just going to develop his entire board and start using his leader ability before he can really get anything going. And they're usually just able to out tempo and just outrush you before you really get your feet settled. And as for Zoro, I think this deck actually doesn't do too bad against Zoro, especially when compared to Katakuri, just because you are able to shuffle around your triggers, and so you're able to put the more defensive triggers into your life, like Thunderbolt or Brule, which can really hamper Zoro's ability to rush you down. As for best matchup, I think blue, either Crocodile or Doflamingo, is your best matchup, just because they don't really have enough firepower to match you, and sometimes they're just not fast enough to really out tempo or outrush you before you start chaining down these 10 drop big moms. But overall, I do think yellow does very well against a majority of decks, and it could go either way. It really is just that law matchup that I really struggled with. And that's it for me, everyone. Once again, if you guys have any more specific questions, just leave them down in the description below. Once again, I linked the deck list down below as well. And if you like this type of content, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And until next time, I'll talk to you guys later.